will alienate the entire video game world. Nobody is ready to buy a console that expensive. Outside of Japan, nobody really knows the Sega Saturn. Resellers are not ready, and third-party developers did not develop any games for the launch of the console. And then comes the Sony keynote, built around the history of Sony, its presentation, its arrival in the world of video games, and a big presentation of the new PlayStation brand. And then comes the turn of Steve Race, the president of Sony Computer Entertainment of America, who will have this legendary sentence.
$2.99.
While he had a speech written, and after seeing the mixed reactions from reporters to the announcement of the price of the Saturn, he replaced it by announcing only the price of the console, $100 cheaper than the Sega Saturn, under the euphoria of journalists. A slap. And history to kill even more Sega, Michael Jackson makes an appearance on the side of Sony, who before was linked to Sega. And then comes the presentation of Howard Lincoln in front of the journalists, and it's not great. A big part of it presents the counterfeits of the Super Nintendo games and even comes to confirm how widespread they are, since they sell more counterfeit games than Sega games. And while everyone was finally expecting a demonstration of the Ultra 64, a few games, the controller, and finally having a release date, Nintendo announces once again that the release of the console has been postponed and that it will be released in April 1996 in Japan, without giving new dates for the United States or Europe. Everyone is upset. It's been more than a year of waiting while the PlayStation and the Saturn are coming, and no one understands. Nintendo just announced they finished designing the console, so why delay its release? Well, as Howard Lincoln tries to explain, the console is ready, but the games are not. Nintendo and the publishers have a lot of trouble developing games on the Ultra 64 for three reasons. Firstly, the architecture of the console is very complex and hard to grasp, especially for developers accustomed to the NES and the Super NES. Secondly, the development kits were designed by Silicon Graphics, so everything is in English. But the Japanese developers were not used to English at that time, so it took a long time to adapt, whether it was for Nintendo or for other Japanese studios. And the third reason is the arrival of 3D. Adding the third dimension also adds a lot of design problems and a lot of freedom. It's not a transition that can be done overnight, evidenced by the really bad games that came out by the dozen on PlayStation at that time. And the next day at the show, Nintendo, aware that Sony is taking the lead and that they won the hearts of journalists, Nintendo shows the Ultra 64 for the first time. It contrasts completely with its previous consoles. First, the console is black, very sober, but above all, it has 4 parts for the controllers, which means that it offers 4 players to play simultaneously, something very rare on previous consoles where you had to bring a fairly expensive accessory and only a few games were compatible. But there is nothing to do. Sony is taking over. Journalists are only talking about PlayStation. Sony is bringing back stars like Michael Jackson to praise the merits of their console, backed with an exceptional promotional campaign, especially with the traditional press. And for weeks, everyone only talks about this war between Sony and Sega, which has just started, and the few pages that mention Nintendo dwell briefly on the Virtual Boy, which has been released in Japan and the US, but which Nintendo didn't even highlight. And little by little, Sony is gaining momentum by announcing the dozens of studios that will work on the PlayStation, with big names like Namco, Ubisoft, Konami, or even Psygnosis that they have bought. The PlayStation is attracting attention, and Sony is planning 12 games for the North American launch of its console, which promises to be grandiose. In order to fight back, Nintendo sends some information here and there. It makes a big promotional campaign to tell players not to buy a 32-bit console, that the console they are preparing is superior in every way, and that it will show up a few months later. And then the PlayStation comes out in the US, and it's off to a great start, even though the CD player issues aren't fully fixed, although Sony has changed the materials around the lens. In just a few weeks, PlayStation catches up with the Saturn, which was released 6 months earlier, and is shaping up to be Nintendo's most serious competitor. And Nintendo knew this very well. In the interviews before its release, Howard Lincoln, for example, underlined the economic power of Sony far above Nintendo and Sega, but had doubts about its ability to produce good games. And indeed, the games at the launch of the console produced by Sony are not very good, or even not good at all. But that does not prevent the console from selling, thanks to an excellent marketing campaign from Sony and an affordable price tag. And on October 20th, 1995, images of the prototype of Final Fantasy VII on the Ultra 64 are sent to journalists around the world, and wow, what a slap. We are very far from Final Fantasy VI. The graphical evolution is surprising, and maybe the Nintendo 64 is as powerful as Nintendo says. With these images, Nintendo sends an invitation to the Shoshinkai, which is held next month, and promises to present the console at that time. And the image of this invitation shows the controller of the console, which seems to embed a joystick. The appointment is made. The Shoshinkai promises to be memorable. November 22nd, 1995, the Shoshinkai is finally here. And it's an amazing show. Lots of new games being shown. Kirby Bowl 64, a Kirby game in a 3D environment, a tech demo of a Zelda game with fights in 3D, a new Mario Kart game called Super Mario Kart R, which shows real-time 3D Mario Kart, up to 4 players at the same time. A huge shock that no one expected, and Nintendo shows what no one else can do. Only the Nintendo 64 offers 4-player games without accessories. Then comes Pilot Wings 64, an ultra-realistic flight simulation that is light years away from what the competition does. And it does not stop. Right after it's Wave Race 64, which comes to show the abilities of the console to manage water, something very complex to program in a game in addition to being a good game in itself. And then it's Star Fox 64, which shows the enormous progress that has been made with the previous one. GoldenEye also makes a very remarkable appearance. Everything seems to be going well for Nintendo. Then the images of the next Final Fantasy are shown, like the next Zelda, and the game is planned on the newly announced console add-on, which will be using magnetic discs that allow more data to be stored than cartridges without having the disadvantages of long loading times. Hiroshi Yamauchi also announces that Dragon Quest VII is in progress and that it will use magnetic discs. Third-party publisher games are also shown with games such as Blastozer, Body Harvest, or Star Wars. But we are still far from all the third-party publishers announced by Nintendo earlier. Beyond the games, the console is also shown with yet another name change. The Nintendo 64 will be its final name, as well as a new logo, and above all, its gamepad. The controller is presented and highlighted by the hostesses who invite people to try it, and it's a huge revolution. It's a 3-branch controller that embeds an analog joystick in the center, a big novelty that will allow to easily and naturally control the characters in a 3-dimensional universe. And yes, because neither the Saturn nor the PlayStation have a controller with an analog joystick, they just followed previous gamepad. But in the meantime, Nintendo has already moved forward. And it will be such a huge revolution that it will be immediately copied during the Shoshinkai. Employees of the Sonic team are present and will take a look at the show, and they will be so captivated by this novelty, well brought by a new game, that they are going to decide to make their own joystick for their next game, which will be Nights into Dreams, which they have confessed during an interview for an issue of the magazine Retro Gamer. But what no one has been able to copy is the notches on the joystick, which make 3D movement more natural. Nobody has been able to copy this because Nintendo patented the innovation. These notches seem trivial, but add a layer of simplicity and ergonomics. Remember, it's the beginning of 3D, and it's really hard to integrate this huge novelty while letting the player take it in hand simply. These notches will remain in Nintendo controllers for a very long time, since they will be used on GameCube and the Wii. But it doesn't stop there, because in addition to this joystick, Nintendo had the excellent idea of adding buttons that will be used to manipulate the camera. A big concern of these 3-dimensional games, since the camera is hard to program and must try to follow the player without necessarily knowing where he wants to go. But the other big revolution that this controller will bring is that this gamepad will adapt itself to games and not the other way around. Thanks to its 3 branches, it can be adapted to 3 different styles of controls. The most classic, and the one that will be used the most, is to have one hand on the joystick and the other on the right buttons, which will allow you to control a character in a 3-dimensional universe. The second is to use the D-pad and the buttons, which is useful in 2D games and resembles the controls of the Super NES. And the third is to use the D-pad and the joystick, which is very useful for FPS, for example, where you can control a character. Aim at the same time, emphasized by the button on the back of the controller, the Z button to shoot, a button which has a different feedback, a slight pinch great for shooting games or for making key combinations. And this controller is so revolutionary that all these new features are still used today in current controllers, and it will help gamers adapt to this new 3D dimension. But beyond all that, what will take Nintendo into a new era is above all the presentation of a beta version of Super Mario 64. And not just a presentation, the game is playable at the show and everyone wants to try it. Super Mario 64 is a huge bombshell and a big revolution. Mario's movements are very natural thanks to the controller and his joystick. There are interactions with the scenery everywhere, the camera management and all these different types of gameplays, whether it's running, diving, swimming underwater, sliding down slides, clinging to ledges, climbing trees, launching yourself with a cannon. It's amazing what Mario can do. And the biggest shock is perhaps graphical, and that's what we see the most in the magazines of this time. This new Mario, it looks exceptional and so revolutionary compared to what has been done before, and this which comes out on other consoles. It's such a huge slap in the face that all the journalists are already considering it to be the